Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we're reading the book Set on Fire, with permission from the author, Taurus Montgomery, a young and successful SDA pastor with a commitment to serving the youth of this generation. The story is an autobiography of his life, where, as a child, he grew up in the hood in Mobile, Alabama. In our last reading, we covered chapter 17, entitled Desire to Learn, where Taurus, in his first 2 years at Oakwood, began to take his education very seriously and apply himself with great diligence to his studies. Remembering the great sacrifices that folks like Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, and many others had made, so that he, Taurus, could enjoy the privileges of education, motivated him to excel. Also, it was impossible to forget that he was on academic probation and had to do well to stay in school. In what has now become typical Taurus fashion, he set out to quantify what he had to do to succeed in college. He determined to do 5 things to improve his grades, and in setting out these 5 methods, he also speaks to the reader and all who want the same objective: success in college. He first determined that failure was not an option. Second, that rest was critical. And third, to seek help when he didn't know by asking questions and getting extracurricular help. Fourth, to develop a love for reading. Not just required reading, but other reading as well. And fifth, to choose to study. Many people really don't know how to study. As he said, if you do what you always did, you will get what you always got. In other words, if you've been studying and still getting poor grades, then you need to learn how to study differently. Taurus did all of the above, then added one more essential ingredient which brought it all together: prayer. In applying these things, his GPA went from a 1.9 to a 3.2, then continued to increase every semester. And soon, he was off academic probation. Taurus continued to excel in class and applied for a scholarship, which he received in the amount of $4,000 from the United Negro College Fund. After his sophomore year at Oakwood, Taurus hit the pause button on his academic learning to enter the School of Service, where he would learn more about the things of life, such as leadership, ministry, poverty, racism, people, money, relationships, and other life lessons which are imperative to a well-rounded personality and education. So, dear readers, please don't forget that you can purchase this book at the author's website, taurusmontgomery.com. That's TaurusMontgomery, taurusmontgomery.com, and read along with us as we pick up the story today in chapter 18, entitled A Mindset of More. I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. C.S. Lewis. I had some really amazing experiences after being in NAPS for 2.5 years. I will never forget my first time traveling out of the United States. In May 2002, I went to Ethiopia, Africa. I had never imagined that I'd be on an airplane for 14 hours. I was so glad to land, But what my eyes beheld as we exited the airport broke my heart. Several small children, ages 4 to 6 years old, rushed towards us with their hands held out. I did not understand what they were saying because I did not know their language. But as they pointed to their hands repeatedly, I knew they were asking for money. Our hosts demanded that we ignore the children because giving to them would create an even more hostile situation. I could not understand that concept for the life of me, especially since I had the money in my pocket. But I took him at his word, and we proceeded to our living quarters. Not only was it my first mission trip overseas, but it also was the first for at least 10 of my peers. There were 14 of us total. As we traveled down a long road to our destination, we shared our bus with an Ethiopian choir. They sang such beautiful music that it brought every one of us to tears. For me, it wasn't just the music, but the scenes I beheld as I looked out of the window. Right before my eyes, I saw more children begging. Some were handicapped. Many were barefoot and clothed in ragged, rugged, torn clothes. It was hard to watch. Our goal in Ethiopia was to build a school for orphaned children and to provide food, clothes, and spiritual nourishment for the people in the villages where we were staying. One of the highlights of this trip, similar to the one we made to my hometown, was that Salt came along with us to Ethiopia. Seeing her in this setting was pretty cool. She was very friendly, down to earth, and it was very clear that God was in her life. She wasn't acting all celebrity-ish. Ananda Lewis, the former host for MTV, was also with us in Ethiopia. The same things can be said about her. In fact, the two of them had decided to rededicate their lives to God. They chose to get baptized in the river, along with the other 161 Ethiopians who had accepted Christ. Much has been said of the pros and cons of short-term mission trips. What is undeniable for me is that this experience positively and powerfully impacted my life in so many ways. After returning from Ethiopia, I came back to America with a new love, respect, and appreciation for those who are less fortunate than I am. I felt a greater sense of obligation and responsibility to do more. To whom much is given, much is required. I also returned home with a fuller appreciation for the things I have. Simple things like a water fountain can be taken for granted. Even a pair of shoes. I learned to be grateful for what I have. I also learned to give away what I have. Although I couldn't give those kids money when we arrived at the airport, I emptied my pockets to them when we were returning home. While the Ethiopia mission was great, I began to feel like there was more that we could be doing than what we were doing. This thought really became strong after our mission to Atlanta. We went to Atlanta to raise funds for our next foreign mission trip to Zambia, Africa. In addition to raising funds, we visited several public and private schools, homeless shelters, and some of the toughest inner-city communities. Our goal at each place was to motivate, inspire, and encourage other youth. On one particular evening, Thanksgiving Day to be exact, we were invited to the Atlanta Braves stadium to be a part of a concert they were having for the homeless. They were also giving away shoes, clothes, food, and other things. We thought we were going there just to play music, but we realized God had something else in mind. This was not a gospel concert. When we arrived, we saw that there were other musicians, rappers, and local artists who were performing. One of the artists was rapper-actor Lil Zone. I walked up to him and started a conversation. During the conversation, which was really a monologue, I told him about the influence he has with his music and fame, and encouraged him to use it for God. Then I prayed with him and went up on the stage to introduce our band. After we played a song or two, one of the young ladies in our group, Tiana, grabbed the microphone and started preaching with power and conviction. She spoke about God's goodness and how He was working in her life. People were crying and asking for prayer. She handed me the microphone, and I prayed for all who were in attendance. These kinds of experiences helped me to see that people needed hope. We all need someone to encourage us to keep on keeping on. Every time we visited a school in the inner city where the kids were doing poorly, I was inspired to motivate them, to think of better ways to influence them for Christ. And the thought that NAPS could be doing more to make a difference would not get away from me. But I had no idea what to do. One day while I was praying, the thought came to my mind to take a semester off from school to go and serve as a full-time volunteer. You see, it was during our school breaks, spring break, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, that we went on our missions. During the summer, we would go overseas. I believed that we could make a greater impact if we were in the cities we visited just a little bit longer. Then we could give more time, meet more people, and serve more people. We needed to have a mindset of more. After praying about it for some time, I got enough courage to share the idea with Dr. Paul. We prayed together. He was supportive. Then it was time to present it to the group. There were 11 of my fellow students who accepted the challenge to join me for the next semester, spring 2003. After much prayer, planning, and discussion, we decided to start our journey in Los Angeles, California, to launch our semester of serving. Part of our plan was to visit as many schools, juvenile detention centers, and rough neighborhoods as we could, with the intention of providing people with hope. There are so many things I can say about that experience, but space in this book will not allow for it. There is one thing that I learned about myself when I met a young man named Derek. He said he was 18. What I discovered is that I'm either very crazy at times or very courageous. We were walking through a neighborhood in Watts, California. It was a drug-infested neighborhood. Trash was littered all along the sidewalk, and dope was being sold in broad daylight. I watched it go down right before my eyes. Derek was a part of the deal. I watched him purchase a bag of weed. When the deal was over, he headed in my direction on a bike. I flagged him down. "What up, man? My name is Taurus. What's yours?" "Derek," he said. Without any hesitation, I asked him, So what you going to do with that weed you just brought that you have in your hand? You know it's going to destroy your present and your future, right? To my surprise, he replied, "Man, I know this must be God, because I just said yesterday that I was going to stop smoking. And that's on everything. Here, give it to me. I'll get rid of it for you." The decision to give up smoking is one of the best choices you'll ever make. Because what you're really giving up is a date with lung cancer, I said jokingly. Again, to my surprise, Derek handed it over. I reached out my right hand and locked hands with him. I placed my left hand on his shoulder. We bowed our heads, and I said a prayer for him to be strong. We talked a little more about his plans for the future, and then he rode off. After I got back in the van, we drove away from the neighborhood. I dumped the weed out into a sewer. I began to realize that I have a God-given influence with young men. For whatever reason, whenever I spoke, they would listen. That was a very humbling thing to know. I began to sense that my life's purpose was connected to my ability to influence them. I ask you, what gifts has God given to you so you can influence and serve others? Is there a specific age group that you have a burden to serve? To know this is vital to your life's success and satisfaction. From LA, we went to Ohio, and then finally to Zambia, Africa. In each place, I had amazing experiences. In Zambia, we visited and led an HIV/AIDS awareness march, visited hospices with small children dying from AIDS, and built a multi-purpose center for conducting various educational and medical programs for the people in a rural area called Choma. I have been to Africa several times, but I believe it was this trip that awakened my love for my African brothers and sisters. It was in Choma that I preached to a large village crowd. The people came out to hear me every night I spoke. It wasn't anything special about me. They were just hungry for the Word of God. It was my first time preaching through a translator, and it made the sermons last much longer. The experience that stands out in my mind about Choma regards a young man we met who was suffering from a terrible disease. He had a huge tumor on his neck. The man looked desperate and depleted. He asked us to pray for him, and the medical doctors treated him as best they could. A few days later, the man came back to say thanks. But we did not recognize him because the tumor was gone and he had cleaned himself up. That brother was ready to grace the cover of GQ magazine. After our 5-month service tour was over, I went back to Oakwood and hit the books hard. After my first semester back, I made a 3.7. I was crazy excited when I saw my grades. I completed my junior year and had one more to go before graduation. But then came that thought again. We can do more. What if we did this for a year? One semester was great. But what if we dedicated 365 days to this thing? How many more teenagers can we influence to stop smoking? How many more juveniles can we tell of God's power to transform them and keep them from committing crimes? How many more young people can we reach for God if we dedicated a year instead of a semester? The truth of the matter is that I really did not want to do it, especially since I wanted to graduate with my class. But it was something beyond me, compelling me to move forward with it. I spent much time in prayer, agonizing with God about it. Once I decided to do it, I was at peace. But because I was at peace with it, did not mean that others were. Some people criticized the idea. You can wait until you graduate before you do that. You have the rest of your life to do that. You need to get your education. Who do you think you are? You can't save the world. One thing I know is that you have to be careful about who you share your plans, dreams, ideas, and goals with. They might hinder you from doing what you know God wants you to do. I've often wondered why God wanted me to take that year off from school. As I reflected on it, I realized that He was shaping me for my destiny. It was a preparation for greater things to come. Even to this day, I'm still applying lessons learned during that year. For me, as long as my parents and my siblings were supportive, it really didn't matter to me what others thought. So I found myself in a similar position. I threw the idea to Dr. Paul. He caught it. I then shared it with my fellow NAPS members. This time, when I addressed the group, there was a greater response. About 32 students agreed to do it. But when we pulled off, there were 13 of us for the journey. In retrospect, I'm glad the numbers got smaller. First stop, New York City. Our goals for the year of dedication YOD mission were similar to previous missions. The key difference, however, was that we were able to stay in a city for not just a few weeks, but for a few months. This enabled us to build relationships with people, which is very important when trying to influence youth. The first 3 months were spent in Manhattan and Brooklyn. While in Manhattan, we stayed on 145th Street. When we relocated to Brooklyn, we resided on Halsey Street. In the beginning, I was quite nervous, though none of my peers knew it. I was nervous and even a bit fearful. Why? Here I was, 23 years old, and responsible for leading a team of 13 young, intelligent, talented college students on a mission across the nation and eventually around the world, sharing hope. I was comforted by the fact that this was something I knew that God wanted me to do. There were some good days and there were some bad days. There were personality conflicts and clashes. There were relationship issues. There were times when I did not clearly communicate because I relied on assumptions. If you want to be a good leader who communicates well, never assume anything. There were also days when group morale was very high and things were clicking. Through it all, we learned to love one another and accept one another's differences. The more I got to know my team, the better we executed our mission. My favorite memories came from speaking at the various juvenile detention centers we visited. What was amazing and hilarious is that every time, and I mean every single time we approached the facilities, the kids knew guests were coming to speak. So they got rowdy. They shouted. They banged on their windows and used obscene language towards us. They made fun of our uniforms. But as soon as we began to share our lives with them, they acted like newborn babies. They cried. They were encouraged and inspired. But I believe we were blessed by the time we spent with them even more than they were blessed. Man, I wish y'all can stay, one said. Time and again, the coordinators of these facilities would tell us, this is the most quiet and respectful they have ever been when we have visitors come here to share. We had similar experiences at the schools where we presented. We did skits, plays, and shared inspirational messages with kids from elementary schools to high schools. We told them about college and stressed the need for them to go. One day, we got a call from Salt to come and speak at a school in Brooklyn with her. She did her thing, and we did ours. She also invited us to her home for a good home-cooked meal. I couldn't believe it. Here I was, a young boy from the hood, chilling at Salt's house with her family. And they were mad cool. We had a great time, but we couldn't get too comfortable. We had work to do. We had the responsibility of raising money for our mission trip to India. In order to reach our goal, we would canvass in Times Square. To canvass means to ask for donations. When people donated, we'd give them a book entitled Peace Above the Storm. Powerful book. Most of the time, we gave them a book even if they didn't donate. Some days, we'd canvass for 5 hours. We were young and energetic, so it wasn't a big deal. Besides, our motivation was the African Indian Siddhis people who needed a school built in their village in the deep woods of Karnataka, India. By the time we left New York, we had visited over 20 schools, group homes, and juvenile detention centers. Raised more than $110,000. The goal was $80,000 for our mission trip to India, and passed out over 3,000 Peace Above the Storm books. I felt really good about what we had accomplished. More importantly for me, I had grown as a leader. Next stop, Hikkaduwa, Sri Lanka. I had never heard of Hikkaduwa until December 26, 2004. That's the day when a massive tsunami killed over 200,000 people in Southeast Asia. I remember picking up the New York Post and seeing the front page. It looked like an ad for a doomsday movie, so I ignored it. Then Dr. Paul called me. "Did you guys see the news?" "Not yet. Why?" I asked. "A tsunami hit several countries and killed thousands of people. Bring in the team. I think we may be going there. Keep it in prayer." Now the newspaper made sense. I informed the group of our change of plans. We prepared ourselves and made the journey to an island country called Sri Lanka. When we arrived, we saw the tragedy firsthand. It looked like a war zone. Houses were destroyed. Families were separated. Children had lost their parents, and parents had lost their children. Our mission was to build homes while also providing medical support and activities for the children to do. That was a mission of hard work. We were grinding from early in the morning until sunset, removing debris and building homes. For the month we were there, we were able to build 5 homes. The people were very grateful, and we were thankful to be there to serve. Next stop, Karnataka, India. We arrived in a city called Mumbai. That place was so crowded with people, over 10 million. It was crazy. It seemed like there were more people there than in New York City, LA, Chicago, Miami, and Houston combined. The amount of poverty was astonishing. Just like I saw in Ethiopia and Zambia, there were small children roaming the streets. Some of them were crippled and blind, holding out their hands and asking for money. I just stood there, with my eyes taking in everything. I was trying to wrap my mind around what I was seeing. I said to myself several times, man, I'm in India. Wow. From Tville, Mobile, Alabama to Mumbai, India. Imagine that. Following God will take you places you would otherwise never have gone. It took no time to realize that motorcycles and 3-wheeled taxis called rickshaws were the primary mode for getting from place to place. And the traffic jams? You have to see it to believe it. If you think you have to be careful crossing the street in downtown Manhattan, try Mumbai. I was glad when we boarded the charter bus to take us to our destination, the interior of Karnataka, India. It was a long drive because we went deep into the country. Our purpose for going to India was to address the educational needs of some Africans in India. They called them the Siddhis people. They were among the poorest of the poor in the country of India. They were desperate for their own school because they were not getting fair treatment at the other schools. Thus, many parents chose not to send their children to school at all. When we arrived, our first task was to visit all of the African Indian AI villages in the region. Our headquarters was in a town called Haliyal. We sought to develop relationships with the children and their parents by meeting some of their basic needs. We also had to prepare the living arrangements for the NAPS team that would come in the next few months, and to secure land so we could start building the school for the children. Our hosts were 2 gentlemen from Africa named Bosco from Ghana and Peter, who was from Kenya. Bosco had been in India for 7 years working with the AI people. Peter had been there for 3 years. They were both students at Spicer College in Pune, India, where they learned the fate of the AI people. Instead of returning to their own countries after their studies, they chose to stay there and try to help make a difference. We joined them to do our part. For 5 months, we toiled. We traveled from one village to another. And just as I saw dogs roaming the streets in my neighborhood, I saw monkeys roaming along the highways and in the marketplaces and on top of buildings looking for food. From village to village, we had the pleasure of teaching children songs about God, encouraging the people when they lost loved ones, singing at their weddings, providing nutritional meals, and teaching the Word of God. Again, I'm delighted to say that there is a school in India where the children of the AI people are receiving an education. One of the great lessons I learned from YOD is this: there are at least 2 reasons that God would lead you to give up something. It's either something that will hurt, or it's something that will help others. I did not know that giving up a year of my education would turn into generations of children being able to receive an education. None of us had any idea that we would be going to India when we made the decision to do the year of dedication. But God did. As our mission in India was coming to an end, we received some exciting news. It came from Philip, a young 23-year-old African Indian man with a boatload of potential. He was sharp, wise, and connected to God. He was a natural leader. He was the leader of the group of 10 students that Bosco and Peter taught the English language to. They even helped a few of them get into college. They were critical to the success of our work there. They served as our translators, and they taught us so much about their culture. We equipped them to do all the things we did when it came to running a mission. From cooking, to building, to preaching, to reading, to logistics, to computers. We taught them everything we could. A few days before we were to go back to America, Philip informed us that they had an announcement to make to our team. In his Indian accented English, he said, "You guys encouraged us for these past 5 months to want to serve God with all our hearts. We're inspired by your work, and now we want to do the same. Myself, Premnath, and Prakash will be doing a year of dedication." The power of influence is amazing. We had no idea that they were planning to do that, and we had no intentions of them doing that. What was so crazy about their announcement was that these guys were giving up a year of their college education, which they were extremely privileged to be getting, in order to do their own year of dedication. I read somewhere that one of the greatest gifts in life is influence, and that God will hold us all accountable for how we use it. Knowing that God had used me to help influence these guys to dedicate themselves for a year of service made my sleep sweet that night as I lay in my tent. Next stop, Huntsville, Alabama. As you can imagine, I learned a ton of things from my experiences during the year of dedication. There were 4 key things I learned as a leader that I believe are critical to being a successful leader with any team, organization, or group. The first one is that successful leaders know their limitations. At first, I tried to do everything myself. I wanted our year to be a success, but I learned to share the responsibility. The deeper issue of trying to do everything is really a lack of trusting people. Because of my own issues, I did not fully trust my team at first. Once I learned to trust them, it allowed them to grow and develop. I also realized that there were things that I was trying to do that they could do 10 times better than me. You have to be able to trust the people you lead just as much as you want them to trust you. The second thing I learned is that successful leaders must be lifelong learners. Just because I was not in school did not mean that I had to stop learning. I had to learn New York driving so I could navigate my team from place to place safely. I had to learn how to approach professionals from whom we were looking to sponsor our missions. I had to learn how to delegate responsibility. I had to learn a new language, a new culture, and even a new way of eating. When you stop learning, you will stop leading effectively. The third lesson is that successful leaders must be servants. This was the hardest lesson to learn because it goes against the culture I grew up in. But I did my best to serve my team by putting their needs before mine. There is no better example of this than the life of Jesus. He always put others before himself. Lastly, I learned that successful leaders value exposure. It's a great teacher. Just being in New York City exposed me to so many things. The city itself inspired me to think bigger. I encourage you to leave your present environment as often as you can so you can be exposed to life beyond your community. Go to a conference, attend a youth camp, go on a mission trip, do whatever it takes to get positive exposure. I'm pleased to be able to tell you that YOD, Year of Dedication, has continued ever since. As I'm writing, the YOD 12 team is preparing to go to Haiti to provide physical, educational, and spiritual empowerment to men, women, and children. It feels good to know that God used me to help initiate a movement 12 years ago that is still making a difference today. That's what happens when you walk in your destiny. The end of chapter 18 of Set on Fire by Taurus, Montgomery.